Thank you very much, John. God, there's so much there, I don't know where to start. Okay. I'm going to ask you what I was going to ask you before you even started, so...
All right.
Ash Wednesday's coming up for us. And on Ash Wednesday, the one thing that'll happen to me is I'll get marked with a bit of ash and told, know that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And I've been slightly reflecting on this in the context of the difference between, as it were, secular dying and Christian dying. And one of the great ironies, I'm mildly irritated by this, I think, is that I'm always perceived of as, because I'm a priest, as being superstitious with regard to death. Though in our culture, I'm probably, as a priest, one of those people who sees death
more commonly,
much more than, we're in a place where death is, you die privately, surrounded by technology, which I think is, very interesting.
Alone, die alone, actually.
You die alone?
Normally.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I really do believe in death. And there seems to be this, perhaps talk a little bit more about the way in which something like our hospitals, our investment, I mean, it used to be the case that the largest building in the city was the Cathedral, and now the largest, most expensive building in the city is usually this university hospital with all its glass and its technology and so forth. And it seems to me that huge investment of money and technology that surrounds death has about it some sort of denial of death.
Absolutely.
Whereas the superstitious one, which is me, I sort of see it and know it and it's real.
Well, the worst superstitions, I mean, I wouldn't call your views superstitions at all, but the worst superstitions are the ones that are clothed in the discourse of reason and of improvement. And I mean, essentially, I guess why death is such a problem in secular cultures, or such a challenge, is there's a certain finality about it. I mean, even if you think there is something like an afterlife, it's the end of what we know in ordinary terms. And the people we love who die are gone, not from our memories, but entirely. And the kinds of, from the rest of our lives, and that's a great kind of shock. And of course, in our own case, I mean, I suppose this is another challenge for each of us, is what untimely death, which is always possible, of course, presents is a final cutting off of possibilities of development in this world. So the idea of, I mean, one of the sort of funny things about these Victorian psycho-researchers is they insisted that progress went on in the other world. That's to say, they would say, well, it may be faltering here, I mean, we can't count on things in this world, but on the other side, it's going much more quickly than here. And so some of them even said Darwinian evolution went on the other side, which, of course, when you think about it, is not terribly plausible, because Darwinian evolution requires death, because it requires generations. It requires propagation and procreation, and they said there was no propagation, no generation now. So how could it go on? But they insisted that it did. They absolutely insisted, because they confused natural selection and evolution, as nearly everybody did, and many still do, with progress, with moving higher and higher. But where death fits into all this is, how can one cope with? It's not, in a sense, almost death itself. It's the mark of sheer, what in non-Christian terms would be fate or contingency. That, once you're gone for good. And also, in an entirely naturalistic perspective, the human species will disappear like any other species will. If you swallow Darwin's message, it's simply one among a variety of species with a limited longevity. And so all that we are, all that we've been, will vanish. And now, of course, there is a sort of humanist view of this, which you're remembered by the people who, etc. I mean, ridiculed, by the way, by Bertrand Russell in his autobiography, where he says he was taught as a child I can't remember some kind of piece of doggerel. There is no afterlife, but we'll all be remembered by other people for the good that we've done, and so on. But if all those other people vanish, and then the human species itself disappears, and then there's nothing at all, it's kind of a challenge. And so I actually one of the reasons I think that these secular versions of secular avatars of religious thinking are encrypted into modern life and won't go away, absurd though they are, I mean shallow myths though they are, is that there isn't really, is that secular cultures really haven't ever come up with a humanly satisfying response to death. I mean, that is one of the reasons, in other words, that's one of the reasons why it's very hard. So if you shed, not that, by the way, I mean, another thing is not that all religions by any means believe in personal immortality or even want it. Lots don't. Yeah. But they all have kind of accounts of human, I mean, Buddhism doesn't, lots of forms of polytheism don't. In Greek polytheism, there was an afterlife, but nobody wanted to be in it, because it was sort of witless, wandering around witless and chattering a lot. The last thing they wanted was to be immortal, and it's unclear in biblical Judaism, actually, that there's much in the way of an afterlife either. But it's certainly deeply rooted in our inherited cultural traditions, and one of the reasons secular thinking is so, I said so embedded, is that it consists in, as you say, kind of denial.
There's one of the things that shocked me on this on a more popular level, when I was a curate and started taking funerals, is the number of people who clearly believed some version of the deceased, Uncle Bob is sort of looking down on me and so forth, like that, but didn't believe in God. So that wasn't really terribly. There wasn't any of that. I don't go to church. I'm not a very religious person. Here's a very familiar sort of conversation.
But there was an awful lot of that in the late 19th and early 20th century.
I think it's Gnosticism. I think it's a version. Maybe. I think it's a version of Gnosticism, which is there is a sort of the self somehow, the spark continues on, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now I think Christianity almost is the flip of that.
Yes.
And one of the one of the bits of scripture that doesn't often get into these sorts of conversations is, and this is rather dull to quote a particular passage, but I think this is terribly important, and that's 1 Timothy 6:16, where it very clearly says, God alone is immortal. God alone is immortal. Human beings have no immortality, intrinsic immortality. Now, I think that's actually an authentically Christian view, and I think the popular view of Christianity is absolutely opposite to that.
Yes, I agree. But I mean, just an interesting historical point, quite a lot of the late 19th century, early 20th century psychic researchers were atheists. And what they held was, now it's interesting in coherence, it's kind of interesting to explore, what they held was, when humans die, it was never clear why only humans should pass on to this other world, especially if you assume Darwinism and that human minds are just a subset of animal minds. But when they pass on to another world which is normally invisible to us, but which is natural. Now, the reason I think this is sort of a queer, and they'll then go on to other worlds, and they go on forever, and they're sort of immortal. That's what in that time. This is a kind of queer idea, is that if another life was a perfectly natural phenomenon, then it would not resolve, passing into this other world, would not resolve any of the dilemmas or perplexities that we experience in this world. We might find ourselves in another world as unintelligible.
More of the same.
Well, in fact, I don't know whether to call this evidence, but there's a text from the late, that's to say the posthumous, the deceased Henry Sidgwick, to this effect. Sidgwick, before he left, I mean, he was an exceptionally honest man in most aspects of his life. Towards the end of his life, he said, I've looked for 30 years for evidence. I found absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. I was looking for, remember, he's not looking for faith. He's looking for scientific evidence. Absolutely nothing. My life has been wasted. But then he says, he knew he was dying at the time. He said, I've found nothing. He said, but if I'm wrong and I survive, I'll be back in touch. And so he left various messages in sealed envelopes, and they were opened later on. None of them, as far as anyone could find out, was ever transmitted back. But a few years later, texts started appearing from, claiming to be from the deceased Henry Sidgwick. Thousands of pages eventually. But one of them I like particularly, it touches on this very thing, which is that he says, the persona, whatever it was, he says, well, I've got the evidence that I always wanted. During my life, I've never found it, but incontestable, indisputable. Here I am. He said, but I remain as baffled as before. And I sort of imagined him finding himself in some great sort of sepulchral Cambridge combination room and looking round and going over and saying, how long have you been here? 800 years. Do you know what we're doing here? No, we have no idea. But, and then he concludes with an aphorism, which is sort of quite striking, really, when you think it's from him. Not a very aphoristic writer, but sort of thing you could imagine him saying. Is he says, and thus I found from my own experience, he says that the riddle of death is no more solved by dying than the riddle of life by being born. I think it's rather wonderful, good, isn't it? Yeah. It's almost Wittgenstein, but that was 30 years later in Cambridge. So, you see, one of these sort of incoherences, like your parishioners, who, you know, they don't believe in God, but they believe in the afterlife, that's actually been very common in, I would say, in what I've studied in British and Western culture for about the last 100 years. As I say, people think there is some, almost as a sort of natural feature of the world, that something carries on, the personality doesn't perish, but they think of it as a kind of, but if it really is simply that we live in that we live in one of several multiverses and we go to a different one when we die or something like that, then the objection, then the Sidgwick problem comes up, which is, you find yourself there, but it doesn't resolve any of the metaphysical or moral or let's say religious dilemmas. You're still as baffled as before. It doesn't tell you anything in a sense. So that's one of the reasons. I mean, I'm deeply sympathetic actually to these psycho-researchers. I mean, I think they're poignant. They have many poignant stories, and also some of them are really great minds. But there is a sort of hidden, well, not even hidden, there is a kind of absurdity in what they're trying to do. Because what they're trying to do is to find meaning from fact. They're trying to demonstrate that human personality does survive. The very honest ones among them say, we never did, like Sidgwick said before. But even if they could, what would it show in and of itself?
And I also have this sense that limit is a threat to meaning rather than
limits.
Limits, yes. So the idea that human beings are limited creatures, limited by death and so forth, that limit is actually some sort of threat to, rather than precisely our identity is formed and shaped by limits. I mean, so they don't understand that, as it were, death gives life its meaning in some rather important sense. There's that fantastic. There's a fantastic essay by Martha Nussbaum about why gods fall in love with human beings. And they fall in love with human beings
because they envy them, partly.
Because they envy them. And why do they envy them? Because there's all sorts of things that human beings who die can do that gods can't do. Yeah. So, for instance, how can a god who is immortal show courage? Because, how courageous would it be to run across a minefield to save someone? Well, that wouldn't be terribly courageous to do. So, actually, what would love for your children really mean if you were really concerned about their welfare?
Or all of the beauty that arises from transience. I mean, if you were going to be around forever, and you knew that, somehow, in other words, it wasn't just that your longevity had been extended. I mean, our longevity is being extended, actually. But even if it was extended indefinitely, even if the aging clock could be stopped, we'd still know we could be killed or in a war or something. But supposing you knew you couldn't be killed, then any kind of form of beauty or value that depends on transience would cease to be accessible.
Which is why the last sentence of your book is about the beauty of the falling leaf or something like that, isn't it?
I mean, what sort of transience allows is new things. I mean, rebirth allows things that have disappeared and then new things come up. Whereas if really you went on forever, we all went on forever. Nightmare idea. I mean, at least, certainly in the secular versions, there's a nightmare idea. Never clear, as it were, in all these, what people sort of do all this time. Because it does look as if in many of at least the time continues, or a version of time, although not aging. Kind of interesting. People have bodies, though not the ones they've had on the earth. They're improved versions thereof. Never less attractive or more frail, but always less frail and more attractive, always. And that's, by the way, one of the links, at times a slightly sinister link actually, between these ideas and eugenics. Because quite a lot of the eugenicists, not widely known, were interested in all this because they thought that if they couldn't, as it were, cleanse the actual species down here on Earth of inferior specimens, then in the afterlife they could actually improve human bodies. We could all have better bodies, bodies which aren't flawed, which aren't subject to aging. Anyway.
You come back at 33. There's a particular form of Christian thinking you come back at 33. And why 33? Because that's the age Jesus died.
Well, at least it's...
Okay, I've monopolised the conversation. We might go on a few more minutes because of that. So could we have some questions, responses, challenges to John?
I think it is absurd. Let me tell you why it is absurd. I think it's absurd in the true sense. About 20 or 25 years ago, and they had a different, I talked in America with some of the cryonic suspension people. And what they think is that by what they want to do, we're cooling down their bodies and freezing their bodies, or some of them, just their brains, to have them resurrected by new technologies in the future. What I said then is what I say now, which is that it's absolutely impossible to maintain that this won't be scientifically feasible, because we don't know in advance what the knowledge limits of science are. As you say, that it has a tendency to accelerate and so on and so forth. So, this is sort of obvious in a way that one can't in advance prescribe what science can do and not do. What can be known with certainty, however, is that anything that science comes up with will feed into the normal conflicts of human history. And the way I put this to them was the following question. How long do you think, now you might not think this, but how long do you think it'll take for this science to get to the point that your cooled down cadavers will be revived and brought back as the persons you were? And they said 200 or 300 years. That's what they said then. Maybe now they'd say 20 or 30, but then they said 200 or 300 years. So I said, well, just think about the last 200 or 300 years. In the last 200 or 300 years, there's been a catastrophic civil war in America, 2 world wars, gigantic stock market crash, dictatorships all over Europe, the Holocaust, etc. Do you really imagine that in the next 200 or 300 years that this won't occur? Do you really imagine that the institutions whereby the companies, at that time I think in the Mojave Desert somewhere, now in Beverly Hills, which put these cavities, they'll still be there, these companies, that they won't have vanished, that the property markets won't have been dissolved, that America won't have disappeared from the face of the earth as many other. Did they really? And they all said yes, we do think that, but it hasn't really occurred to us that this won't. In other words, what they were assuming was the immortality of human institutions. If human institutions are, as they obviously are, speak to any Central European who's lived for the last 80 years in Central Europe, they've been under 3, 4, 5 regimes. Fascism, communism, liberal democracy, various forms. It's normal in most of the world, and will be normal, is normal everywhere, if you think in terms of centuries. No part of the world is exempt from this. That's normal history. So if normal history carries on, which I assume it will, then whatever is developed, whether it be Kurzweilian uploading or further developments in cryonic suspension, will feed into the normal conflicts. And what we'll have is what we already see, which is cyber technologies being used, not just being disrupted by war, but being used in war. I mean, the next branch of war is cyber war, which involves things like destabilizing people's nuclear power stations, shutting down their airports and water systems, moving all the money out of their banks and so on. It's already happened in the Baltic states, actually, just in the last couple of years. The whole country was almost shut down for a few days by cyber war. And I'm sure this will develop more and more. So there's no way out of mortality that way, even if it becomes possible for a small number of human beings in a small number of places for a small period of time to live for kind of a lot longer. Normal history will normally supervene, and they will be caught up in the normal conflicts of history themselves. And that's, by the way, not even taking into account issues like climate change and global warming, which might change the whole context in which this occurs. Well, yours is exactly the response I was satirizing. And soVe heard it many times before.
I'm sure you have. I wasn't expecting to come up with anything original. I humbly knocked back by an eminent professor, but it's merely the way that your talk comes across.
What I'm saying is this, is that secular, I mean, whether or not one needs a sort of a fantasy, the idea that human history can alter from what it has been in the past. I mean, let me just make 1 or 2 comments about that. It's only really in the last 200 years, I would say, from the second half of the 18th century, that this particular illusion has been essential to mental equilibrium. No one before about 1750 certainly really imagined that the future of the human species would be radically different from the past. And yet, were they all living in utter despair? Was Homer living in despair? Were the Buddhists, were the Bhagavad, were the Hindus, were the Taoists? All that nonsense. They had meaning in their lives, even though this idea of progress that has now colonized practically the whole of religion as well as everything else, and I would say corrupted religion, was unheard of until, it depends when you think it sort of got going and so on, but there was certainly no notions of it, maybe in some kinds of early Protestantism and then later on in the Enlightenment. Definitely not before the start of the 18th century. So it's only 300 years in human history. Were they all floundering in utter despair before that? I suggest to you that if one reads the ancient Chinese poetry, Japanese poetry, Greek poetry, Roman, if one reads anything, one finds that they weren't. So I think this is just a modern disorder, a sickness. It's a form in which, without our particular illusions, people think, we'll fall into despair. Well,
and I wouldn't say, from a Christian perspective, I wouldn't say that, I react against your word optimistic about Christianity. If you read St. Augustine, I'm not quite sure how Augustine is optimistic.
No, I wouldn't think he's very optimistic.
He's not optimistic.
At all, actually.
No. I don't think of them as many of those sorts of early fathers as optimists.
Neither is Paul. I would say this. The notion, in other words, that there will never be a confluence of the city of God and the city of man, not now, or not next week, or not next year, but never, is, I think, one of the important insights, if you like, of Augustine. It's a very important one because traditions that can either make that distinction or which simply don't have the idea of the everlasting, but do have some idea of the eternal. Which have never looked forward to everlastingness as being even remotely desirable, with lots of mystical and other traditions. Never have, actually, both in the West and outside the West. I think they're in a better position to preserve or create meaning than these ones which depend upon completely fantastic historical narratives extended into the future. I tell you what I'm not interested in. I'll give you an example. About 3 weeks before the Iraq War, I addressed a group in which I was asked what I thought would happen. I said, well, the war is absolutely unavoidable now. All the materiel is out there. It's taken 6 months to get there. And so it's going to go ahead, and it's going to be a complete catastrophe. And so I said, well, if I thought that, I would give up. I just think, well, how utterly childish can you get? What you should be thinking about is how to deal with the impact, if you want to make an effect on the world, of a disaster which is now not preventable. 3 weeks before, and we all knew, we didn't know it was going to be exactly 3 weeks, but we knew it was going to be jolly soon, certainly the next couple of months from that point. We knew that. We knew that the war would be launched. We knew that they were all there. We knew that all these forces had been massed there for a kind of an attack. It had been going on for ages and ages. Rather than sort of saying, well, if I can't have the historical narrative in the future that I want, I'm going to stamp my feet and give up. It's better to think of, as it were, the engagement with history, if you want to think of it like that, in something like the terms you suggested, which is each life is an eternal life. So in each life you do whatever you think is important. And you don't sort of have any idea of changing the whole course of human history. And if you can't believe that you're going to change it, like they believed that they could in the next 3 weeks stop the war. Utterly absurd, truly absurd. Then I'm giving up, I'm packing it. I think that's the sort of attitude that I want to resist, because I think it's childish, and it shows the excessive dependence on a certain kind of historical narrative. And if you think of eternity as being really exemption from time, or something different from time, or something that can interact with time but isn't wholly temporal.
Could I just briefly come back on that? So
Yeah.
it seems there's a gap between pointing to the absurdity, to use your term, of hoping that the totality of history will turn out as it will.
Or even particular events. or even particular events.
And on the other, claiming that the universe is purposeless.
Well, let me just gloss that briefly because it's quite important. What I meant very specifically there was what all of these Edwardian and Victorian thinkers reacted against in Darwinism. It was specifically about Darwinism. What they reacted against, and what even Darwin himself reacted against. If you look at the last page and the penultimate paragraph of Origin of Species, you'll find this. What they reacted against was the logic of natural selection itself, which in his autobiography Darwin says, but he didn't hold on to it. He says, natural selection operates like the wind. It's not going anywhere. Now, if you think of that, then humans as natural animals come about without any purpose involved. And if they disappear, it's without any purpose. I mean, that is the Darwinian message. And that was what it wasn't, as Dawkins and others have suggested, that what the Victorians feared and dreaded about Darwinism was that it was a non-religious account of creation. What they feared and dreaded about it was that it seemed to empty the universe of human meaning. And so many of them, what they then sort of wanted was to find through science, to inject through science some of the meaning that science appeared to have removed. And so the purposelessness that they objected to was sort of in the theory. And now, interesting, if you look at that last page in Darwin, what he says, well, here we've got natural selection, the last page of Origin of Species. He says, but, I mean, this is Darwin the Victorian speaking. He says, we have progress. We move from microscopic animals to worms. He was very interested in worms, to the lower animals, to the higher animals, to us. Then he concludes, and thus the process is one of progress to perfection. That's on the last page of Darwin's Origin of Species. So I think Darwin's theory, I mean, I'm not a sort of dogmatic Darwinist. I think all scientific theories are hypotheses or conjectures, so, I wouldn't go to the stake for it. But if it's even an approximation of the truth, a rough approximation, it is still a challenge. It is still a challenge, and it's sort of not. It's not as easy to get round it by, as many people have thought, and you can feel it very powerfully in these Victorian writers. And for one thing, every single one of them mentions Darwin. Every single one of them talks about Darwin repeatedly in everything they write. So we don't have to sort of interpret it. They say that the meaninglessness they're confronted by is one which has been sort of brought into their lives by this scientific theory. But where they're distinctive, if you like, is that they turn to science, not religion. They've either not had religion to start with, or they've given it up. They turn to science to bring back the meaning that science has taken away.
Can I pose one last question, because we're on time? One of the things that perhaps, for me, has tied together the three the themes that you've had is something about the avoidance of tragedy.
Absolutely.
Within those sorts of things. I mean, because, Pelagius, his idea is you can be perfect, and you're perfect simply by following the rules. And if you follow the rules, then all is well. And there's no deep moral conflict. There's no possibility for tragedy. Just do it or don't do it. Augustine, on the other hand, has a deeply tragic view of Christianity. The same with this sort of secularized eschatology, which is, everything will end up, we're at the sort of sunny plains of progress that science contains, again, without recognizing the tragic is, and also with the death stuff. So perhaps I wanted to ask you just a little bit on specifically on tragedy as a theme in your work, maybe.
Well, it's a theme. I wouldn't say it's a dominant theme, but it's a very important theme because I guess what tragedy in this context means, and this was certainly something I got from Berlin, among others, is the idea that even if you do the right thing, the right act can have irreparably bad consequences or aspects. And I'll just tell you, I'll only take a couple of sentences. A story he told me, which was one he knew from personal experience in the Second World War, which sort of illustrates this. In the Second World War, he said, a government minister appeared in Britain before his staff, in particular for his kind of the people who typed his, about 20 of them, said, I'm going to do something which is terribly unjust. I'm going to fire you all. And I'm going to fire you because there's a leak from this department. We have reason to believe there's a leak from this department going to the enemy somehow. And as a result of that, brave men and women are dying in terrible circumstances, being tortured to death and God knows what. He said, but it's a terribly wrong thing I'm doing. And I want you to think about it. If you think about 5 minutes, it was in one sense, because not one of them, I mean, only one of them was guilty out of the 20, but didn't know which one it was. And all the rest would have their lives permanently ruined. It wasn't just not having that job. They'd never get another job in anything sensitive or anything important, except it was ruining their entire lives. But I'm going to do it because I think it's the right thing to do, because it's part of the war effort, but also it's unfair to these other people who are being, if we don't do it. So in other words, there's a sort of ultimate conflict of ethical values here. Now, one way you can sort of resolve this, which is the kind of way that some people would now say, well, that's all nonsense. You just calculate what's the best outcome, Jeremy Bentham or something like this, John, utilitarianism, whatever. Then you needn't regret it. He shouldn't have come in and said, I'm about to do the right thing. I mean, this has actually been said to me, and this I find absurd too, by the way, in a Monty Pythonish way. They say, well, you should have just got up and said, I'm going to do the right thing, and you're going to be fired. And some of you, of course, will have ruined lives, but there we are. You know, it's all part of the better. You know, I'm sure this is the right thing. Well, I think one of the reasons, back to a conversation we had earlier about virtue ethics, this is kind of rather queer, is that someone who could do that, who could actually ruin the lives even of 19 out of the 20 people, let's say there were exactly 20, without feeling any kind of flicker of contrition or remorse, would be a moral monster. We wouldn't want people like that running our affairs or something. So someone who can see that there is a terrible injustice involved, but who doesn't want to wash their hands and say, well, I'll just resign, someone else will resolve it. Or doesn't want to stick to some really Pelagian-like rule and say, you should never punish people who are innocent, because you would know, the one thing you would know is that 19 of this, or nearly all of them, were innocent. You should never do it. So I just won't do it, whatever the consequences. Someone who's more morally, I would say, adult than that, and who's concerned about it, knew what it would mean if we'd lost that particular war, and knew even apart from losing the war, what it meant for people to be parachuted down and tortured to death and perish in various terrible ways and so on. Wouldn't just say, well, I'm sticking to the rule. They would be faced with precisely this tragic dilemma, if you like. And I think tragic in the sense of dilemmas which can't be decided in ways in which there is no irreparable loss.
Yeah, exactly.
I think they're quite recurrent in ethical life and don't just happen in the middle of terrible wars. I think they happen actually, not all the time, fortunately, but they're recurrent. And I would say they're part of the human territory. So if you want to sort of, it's a bit like getting rid of death. If you want to sort of eliminate them from human experience, maybe we could sort of clone people who didn't have these dilemmas. Maybe we could produce these moral monsters. People would just go around maximizing things. Although I think, you know, the whole Benthamite and utilitarian, it's sort of coming back now, by the way, with the gross national happiness. You've heard about that as part of this wonderful new regime we're living in. I think the whole thing presupposes the kind of exactitude which is not achievable, a kind of exactitude. We can't tot up. You know, if we could tot up all the headaches in the world and add them up in some and say, if we just perform 2 or 3 terrible experiments on human beings or sentient animals, we'd get rid of all these minor headaches. That would be an improvement. And that must be an improvement if you accept some kinds of utility. I mean, completely ridiculous. Even if it was, I would confidently reject it. I don't want a world free of minor headaches if that's what it's going to cost. I think you're entirely right that the tendency of secular thinking, nearly all of it, not all, Freud's different, for example, so was Berlin, but and he was a secular thinker, but the tendency is to repress tragedy the way death is repressed, because it's something sort of can't cope with, can't get round, can't circumvent. It marks the limit of human will. You can deny that it exists. You can say, well, there isn't tragedy. It just shows we've miscalculated. You know, that's all tragedy is. It's an error of calculation.
Yes.
Yeah. Or you can deny that there is death, or you can say that somehow Kurzweil or Cryonics suspension or whatever will get us around. But that's really a denial, I think, of enduring features of human life. Enduring features, which, as you've pointed out, I mean, it's not just that they're enduring, they are part of what gives human lives the meaning that they do have. And if you take them away, You can't take them away anyway. I mean, that's, if you want a bit of optimism in what I'm saying, all these ideas of taking away these things are completely absurd. I mean, this kind of world of moral monsters who don't feel things, who don't die, who calculate things correctly, it's never going to come about, so we needn't fear it. One can perhaps reasonably fear attempts to bring it about, because they are normally disastrous. But that type of world is just not ever going to come into being. And this is where Augustine was right, and where the Buddha was right, and where all religious thinkers who say this, in a sense, something fundamentally contradictory in human beings, some kind of fundamental. I mean, that I see as a reason for permanent optimism, actually, because none of these horrible ideas of transcending our humanity and becoming something different will ever come about.
That's just got to be the place to end, hasn't it? That's just got to be the place to end, on an optimistic note, and a lecture about almost the opposite. So thank you very much indeed, John Gray. Thank you.